Interning, volunteering at CCTV.
Hello, and welcome to Text for Nothing Conversations with Poets. There's been a little hiatus for summer, but now we're back, and as usual, gonna be on air the first Sunday of every month from 6:30 to 7. Also, you can watch the show through in the channel on YouTube. You can now listen to the audio of the show in SoundCloud. You could watch it also on the website textfornothingtv.com. So tonight, my guest is translator, poet, scholar Donald Wellman, and I'm so glad that you are joining me tonight.
Thank you.
I usually meet my guests at a bar just down the street so we can start chatting and having a few beers before we. I wish we could drink it on in the air, but I don't know if that's possible. But anyway, so we were talking, and one of the things that you mentioned was the reason for writing and reading poetry, something that you wanted to talk about.
Well, I don't know why. I used to think that, like Creeley, I'd discover something. But now I'm not so sure that I'm not discovering some pre-existent form. So I've given up on the idea of form, or as Buckminster Fuller or any other engineer might call it, structural integrity. And I love the random blur of references and emotions that I discovered in some Latin American poetry like Vallejo, and in some very contemporary North American poetry. I think Lisa Robinson, for instance. These are just, or Jay Wright, these are just tremendous poets who don't have a mission. They just enjoy the twists and turns of the line, and sometimes if you read it carefully you'll realize there are 3 or 4 lines. So there's no hope for structural integrity. There's just a hope to see these sparks, these instances, these moments in the chain of perception that you can say, that's interesting. That's why I write poetry. Those little sparks.
Yeah, okay. And why read poetry? That was the other part.
Well, that's why I read poetry too.
Right.
And one reason I became a translator is I'm a bad translator, although sometimes I get good mentions and stuff. But as I have to struggle with every word, I'm always finding surprises in every poet that I try to translate. There's a line, Tahona Estuosa, in a poem from Vallejo, and the line ends with bizcocho.
Yeah.
You know, in some versions, in some dialects, bizcocho does not mean biscuit or shortcake. It means blind. And the half-blind poet is a great metaphor for how poetry proceeds.
Right. Nice. And how did you become, like, how long have you been translating, and how did you make the step or the folding from poet to translator?
Well, basically I was bored with my life. For 10 or 12 years I edited a sort of well-received avant-garde journal, and one of my co-editors has won many prizes for translating Spanish. But when she became feeble to some degree, her name is Cola Franzen, I took a sabbatical year and learned Spanish. So I've only known Spanish since 2002.
Oh, wow. Nice.
But I knew Germanic languages. I was originally supposed to be a Beowulf scholar, so I knew languages, and I had translated from German. I'd even translated, Le Petit Jean de France et le Transsibérien, or it's Le Transsibérien et le Petit Géant de France. So that's by Blaise Cendrars. It's one of the great railway poems, and it's full of unexpected incidents. You can actually find that in one of my favorite journals. It's called Jacket 2. It's published in Australia. It's the continuation of the original Jacket.
Yeah, it's a great website, yeah.
And the next version of Jacket was moved to Philadelphia, and that's a great website too. But Jacket, it remains a great website, publishing lots of great stuff.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, I do absolutely. And so I was thinking about the movement between translating and poetry, and there's something about particularly the idea of voyages. Like there's
yeah,
two different
absolutely,
there's two
yeah.
poles that I can see in your poetry. One is a very close reading, a close knit of references of poets such as Olson and Creeley
Right.
or other international different languages. And then the other is something very personal, and something that you call ethnography or autoethnographical poetry.
It's two or three things.
Right.
The first thing was I was going to do my PhD in Old English. And
Right.
the great Old English poems like The Seafarer and The Wanderer are poems of voyage.
Right.
And I never would give that idea of a sacred voyage up. Even though I'm a fallen Catholic, I still believe in sacred voyages.
Right.
And I love the pilgrimage sites in Morocco, etc., etc. And the other point was, ethnology. Well, I tried to use the influence on my work of several well-known individuals. There's obviously Jerome Rothenberg and Pierre Joris. They've been good, supportive friends. But it turns out that my second father-in-law was a great cultural anthropologist. His name was Victor Turner, and I spent a lot of time reading his scholarship.
Mhm.
He's written 7 or 8 books on liminality, on the turning point in a lifeline or something like that.
Right.
And in the turning point, in a lifeline or even in a celebration, like Carnival in Rio, the ordinary people take over the city. They become
Right.
the police. So those people who are usually beaten and shoved into jails become the jailers and the celebrants of the city during Carnival. These sort of upside-down moments are all over Turner's poetry.
Right.
And Bakhtinian too.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and also so does that relate to the hybrid nature of some of your texts?
Yeah, I always have a sort of. I want to be hybrid on at least 2 levels. I always have a narrative that has some spiritual meaning for me, and I try to understand rituals, whether they're in Alaska or the Southwest or Oaxaca, and I don't know what happened in between. So at the same time I'm doing that, I'm not being a good ethnographer. I don't know if Dennis Tadlock is actually a good ethnographer. Like me, he likes to find moments that charge his imagination to the fullest extent.
Right.
And that's how I am. So I might have an ethnographic and an autobiographical and a surrealist layer working together in any one of my poems.
Right. Right. And so that is and you include images as well.
Ah,
Like
yes,
that
yes.
is in Cranberry Island
Yeah, I
series,
have.
in
Well,
your
when I
latest
came
one.
to work on the Cranberry Island series, my mother inherited property there when I was only like 4 years old, so I've known that place since that time. And I reflect on the history as if I were Charles Olson.
Right.
And that's, I mean, it's fascinating. So I interviewed relatives. I interviewed one relative who is perhaps half Passamaquoddy, and she speaks about the woman I knew as Aunt Lulu, and she said, "Oh, we don't have anything to do with Aunt Lulu." She was 83 or something at that time. She's so proud. She's so persnickety about not being Native American in any part. So I have that kind of thing of sorting out the identity of these historical figures and family figures associated with the Cranberry Islands, which was when I was in love at 20 or 25, I took my girlfriends, my first wife-to-be. I was in love with the romance of the Maine coast, but when my brother contracted a fatal disease because of Agent Orange poisoning, I started to look at that community from all angles, the romantic and the tragic.
Right.
And so I always have a theme. I just don't look for integrity of the engineering
Structure.
variety.
You're moving away from
I mean,
those
history is so messed up. I mean, so very messed up.
Yeah, and you're moving away from those superstructures, or what
Yeah,
Lyotard
yeah,
was
yeah,
calling
yeah.
the great narratives of the
Well,
modernists.
well, I think of serial poetry because in writing the Cranberry Island series, I discovered several things. I'm on a little trip, you know. The oldest magmatic rock in the United States is
Right.
called the Cranberry Island series. So I'm excavating history as as an archaeologist. That's very Olsonian, but
Yeah,
I enjoyed
exactly.
it.
Right. Yeah, you mentioned that in the book.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, that's one of the references.
One of the good things about the book is my work with Olson's transcription of a Coast Guard article about the Native Americans in Maine.
Right.
So working that through my own sensibilities was great fun.
Yeah, and how do you also explain, because the hybrid is not only different types of poetry, but also there's
People.
essays and people, and there's interviews, and there's
And-
also explanations of what Olson meant by transcription.
There is that. And now, since then, I've tried to write translingual poetry that works phrases from different languages
Right.
together.
Right.
So that's a new thing, but for 2 books.
But the North Atlantic Wall has already some.
Yeah,
when
yeah,
you do
right.
that, Santiago de Compostela, and then you end up in Morocco.
That's like peregrinatio pro amor Deus,
right.
which is what the Anglo-Saxons did and what the Middle Age Christians going to Santiago de Compostela. And then the Hajj, of course, is a main metaphor for life in Islam. So I work those all together.
Nice. Yeah. And so then the other side of that is, because that is a personal voyage.
It is personal.
It's a
Saves
personal
my
voyage.
salvation. as
Yeah.
well.
And then your latest book, that the Cross in Mexico, is also that.
That's very ethnological.
Yes. But it's also your experience. Is like.
It's true, it's my experiences, but the only time I really exist in that book is when I quote statements from local informants who say things like, the tourists will be the first to die
Right.
when we have an uprising. things like that. Mexico is so associated with, death masks, La Catrina, the wrestlers in their superpowered death mask.
Yeah.
I just know all of that stuff one day we're going to be marching and singing to the goddess up in the mountains, and I'm going to be the straggler.
And on the other side of this is a very culturally charged and intellectually charged poetry and thinking and writing. So you have a constellation of people that you talk about, that you refer to, that you work with. And so that is another pole. And those 2 poles are in a constant tension in terms of your poetry.
I find something I'm going to pick up on. So in essay poems, I love the discussion about the Cora, which is a receptacle, and that might be the womb, but Judith Butler says not. So I begin that book by saying, on that island, there is a nation with penises in their forehead.
Right.
Which is a reflection on Plato's Timaeus and Judith Butler. So I play with these intellectual
Right,
forces.
exactly. So that is a very different way
Yeah,
than going
yeah.
back to Cranberry Island and
Unfortunately.
looking at your family's plot and what
Yeah.
cousin live across the street, and you're now moving in these greater narratives, or rather not narratives, but these sort of cultural discussions at a different level.
It's very strange. I did an academic book on expressivity, which is about Olson and Deleuze and Guattari and all that kind of stuff. And they were so slow to give it to me to proofread that I wrote these essay poems in between.
Oh, really? Oh,
So
right. I see. I
all-
can see that.
All of the intellectual material that was buzzing in my head as an academic, I transmogrified into
those
poetry.
poems, right? And that, whoa, my chair just kind of stopped.
It's still the same thing. Like one
Right.
of those poems is about Judith Butler and Timaeus, as I said, Plato. But another poem is a catalog of all the gay poets I knew in Boston in the 70s.
Yeah.
So it just somehow I say I'm going to write about this. I'm going to write about that.
Right. and you just mentioned Deleuze and Guattari and the
Yeah,
sense of
right.
the rhizomatic is throughout your work.
Right.
Because that is maybe some way that is not necessarily a tension between the poles in your work, but they're both just different ends of a rhizomatic system.
I'm trying to be original. So I'm all for the rhizomatic system, and I'm sort of against extreme verticality.
Yeah.
But I like an onion. I like rhizomatic work that is layered.
Right.
That's my model now. I think it's a little original, but probably Denise Levertov thought of it too.
And so how would you explain to someone if they don't know what the rhizomatic system is, or what that layer or that layering that you're talking about?
Well, again, it's a hobby horse, just like my work with the Old English. When I wrote my dissertation on Ezra Pound and Olson, I absolutely felt I had to explain the word superposition.
Right.
So that's it. Rather than collage being flat like all the great theorists say, I say it's a series of superpositions. And what you see when you look with one light through the superposed entity is as good or better than a stained glass window.
Right.
So all of you great people, who's his name? T.D. somebody is the great art historian. Even Marjorie Perloff. They talk about flatness.
Yeah, collage. Yeah.
And I say, you're not seeing what you can see if you look through. And what you see if you look through are these dynamic energies intersecting. I started with that in my dissertation on Pound, and I've never let it go.
Oh, I would love to read that. Because you also use parataxis and paratactic,
Yeah, well,
which is part of, like, I was
all of
understanding
that, right?
it like a collage.
But now I'm saying there are 3 or 4 levels of parataxis rather than just one.
Right.
So if you want a linear story, you're missing the truth of serial poetry or Charles Olson or any of them, because all of their narratives are multi-layered.
Right.
And that's what I think that's the true meaning of my work with ethnography too. I
Right.
just don't record one creation story. I realize the overlap of various creation stories, but also, you know, there's the story of the sacred twins. But is that Aztec or Mayan? And why does it become the leading metaphor in Leslie Marmon Silko's work? I just can't stop.
Right. And so, no, that is very, very interesting. And I was thinking about I lost my train of thought. No, oh, right. So it is you're talking about the paratactic collage and multi-layer, and that's really interesting. But for example, in expressivity, you start with at some point you mentioned that the connection to poetry is not cinema but painting. Can you go a little bit into that?
I might have to change that. But
yeah, all day I've been thinking about that line, and now you're like, I'm just going to change it.
well, it's painting because painting, even collage, proceeds by overlapping. Except for extreme minimalism, there is overlapping. And I still believe that in the overlap, you see something new and different and unexpected. Whereas if you just find the line through the overlap as though there were no overlap, it's just narrative.
Right.
So my narratives have to overlap at significant nodes, like the node of the sacred twins. You know who the sacred twins are in Christianity, more or less.
In Christianity? No.
Yeah.
Who are they?
Adam and Cain, Cain and Abel.
Oh, of course, yes. Yeah.
So there are so many stories about sacred twins or sacred brothers.
Right,
So why not write about the Guatemalan sacred twins with a little innuendo?
Right. Right.
I haven't figured that out, actually. I need to work all that stuff more. I have a cousin named Mac Wellman who wrote several plays about the Mecca and other symbols of Aztec lore. He's wrote 3 or 4 plays about it. He's very well produced. But that's it's a big world.
Yeah.
Mac is a genius.
And how do you start when you want to start a new project? Like that is, you were waiting for the proofs for expressivity in modern poetry while you wrote the essay poems.
Well, I might as well just say the truth.
Please do.
Almost as an exercise. I wrote 23 strophes of an unnamed poem that used the word dick in every 23 strophes. And I was having so much fun playing with the readers, both being offended and the reader wondering, how can he bring dick into this poem about the boy who conducted the murders in the what's his name, in the church in Charleston, South Carolina.
Right.
So there's one verse about him.
Yep.
And there's another verse about people in West Virginia who don't care if they're dying of cancer because their fathers died of cancer. And then, of course, the cancer has to apply to their genitals.
Right.
So I had great fun, although there are many tragic moments. And that started the book going. So I wrote, that's an essay poem. You want to know what an essay poem is? An essay poem follows the advice of Adorno that as a philosopher we can no longer write about God or absolute truth, but we could write a little spontaneous essay.
Right.
So my essay poems are in that Adornian tradition.
Oh, so like based on the essayist form.
Yes.
Yeah.
Based on the
that's
essayist
interesting.
form.
Yeah.
And I'm aware that it goes all the way back to Alexander Pope, and it's actually, Lucretius. There are so many essay poems in the history of poetry.
Lucretius is amazing.
Exactly. So I just said, I'm going to have fun. Everybody else who wrote essay poems had fun. So I just decided to have fun.
And has fun been part of your praxis, or this is something
It is,
new?
because I smile. When I see these overlaps, I see a truth that I never expected to see or write about. Actually, in every 23, all of the Dick poems, it's amazing how many moments of political truth, it's maybe my most political poem, appear in that sequence of just having fun.
Yeah, that is very unusual to hear, because that usually you think of the poet as somebody who suffers, somebody who's like trying to get something.
Right.
But this idea of enjoyment and fun while working out these things is something unusual that I don't hear that often.
I don't think, I'm a very melancholy person, but I even have fun being melancholic. Like, talk about Deleuze and Guattari. One of the overlaps I love is Nathaniel Hawthorne in the Blithedale romance talks about his narrator being able to change history by telling the story of what's ultimately Margaret Fuller from different points of view. So I just think that's fantastic.
That is fantastic.
Who else would talk about writing a story being a way to change history other than, somebody who'd read contemporary quantum mechanical theory?
Right, exactly.
And who was the poet who did that? Charles Olson. Instead of patterned integrities, he read about forms that generated forms.
Right.
Which I like. That's good.
Right. And so tell us a little bit about Olson. Seems to be one of the key. In Pound and Olson seem to be two pillars of your poetic thought.
As Mark Scroggins said, I said, I'd like to be an avant-garde poet. And he said, no, you're an unredeemed modernist. That's because of Pound and Olson. So I can't get away from them, I guess.
Right.
I don't know. There's many problems I've had. Rachel Blau-Duplessis says that my reading of Olson is the best queer reading of Olson.
Oh.
Because Olson was twined with so many queers from, anybody from Paul Blackburn to Ginsberg to John Wiener's.
Yeah.
Endless litany of wonderful queer poets are all over Olson. So I like that. So I can tell Olson's story from a different point of view.
Right.
That's
right.
all.
And you also we're having a few minutes left, and I wanted to talk about the magazine that you used to edit, Oars.
Oh, that was great. I was known all over the world very briefly for 10 years. Every library in the world carried it. It was not the first of its sort. Other people did anthologies, but as I folded language poetry in with surrealism and surfiction, it was kind of unusual.
Right.
And I never worried about a synthesis about the different styles of poetry. And many people, even today, if I go to a conference, they say, "Oh, Oars, I have a copy of that. It's sitting on my desk," or even sitting on her desk. Isn't that amazing?
And does it come from the idea, because we have 1 minute left, and this is a beautiful image when you're talking about
When you
when
roll,
you roll, you're looking
backwards,
back,
you get a little eddy.
but you're also moving forward, but looking back.
That's right.
That is
And
like
even more than
Walter
that,
Benjamin
I'm
is.
thinking about Zukowski's horses.
Oh.
Every eddy is also a horse running away from the boat.
Oh, that's awesome.
It's awesome.
Nice.
It's been displayed as a graphic poem all over the world at one time or another.
That is amazing. Thank you so much for being here. This has been Don Wellman, and we are here at Text for Nothing, Conversations with Poets. And thank you so much for tuning in. We'll see you soon. Any information is, as always, in the website. Links to Don's work, to his biography, and